Please be seated. Good morning. This year, my children are in 7th and 8th grade. I am finding that I cannot say anything at home without one of them looking at me and saying, "Dad, it's not like that anymore." Somehow, between 5th grade and 6th grade, they learned everything. The other day at dinner, my son told me that we need more money. He pointed out that both of my brothers have higher incomes than I have, and they have better stuff, and they are happier, of course. And so began a spirited debate about the nature of happiness. And my wife and I agreed that poverty really does overlap with unhappiness. There's all kinds of data that shows poverty creates terrible lifelong anxiety and real unhappiness, and it is an awful, awful way to live. There's also data which says that once a person reaches a certain economic threshold in which their basic needs are met, the correlation between money and happiness almost totally evaporates. There's just very little relationship between the state of your bank account and the state of your heart. Turns out that pursuing happiness directly is troublesome because it puts one's own self, one's own ego, at the center of one's own life. And we have a name for that condition. It is narcissism, when you organize the world around yourself. Happiness, it turns out, is a byproduct of an otherwise well-lived life. The writer David Brooks puts it this way: most people don't form a self and then lead a life. They are called by a problem, and the self is constructed gradually by their calling. So I told my kids that happiness really comes from two places. Money isn't necessarily associated with either of them. Happiness first correlates quite strongly with relationships. Meaningful relationships lead to happiness. The second is meaningful engagement in the world. Committing yourself to solving a problem that affects other people does not bring immediate happiness, but it brings great meaning over time. And in the long run, that seems to create happiness. You would not believe the eye rolls I got, and I explained this to my kids while trying to get them to eat their vegetables. They weren't having it. And so I finished the debate, as I do so often and so unsuccessfully, by saying, "Kids, you know what? The Bible agrees with me." We heard one of those Bible stories this morning, the parable of Lazarus and the rich man. And to better appreciate it, a little context from first century ancient Israel helps. Back then, people thought that wealth was a sign of God's pleasure. It was a reward for living righteously. Likewise, poverty was a sign of God's displeasure, and it was a punishment for doing something bad. And so often people with wealth flaunted it. And one of the things they were supposed to do to demonstrate just how favored they were by God was to give generously the scraps from their table. They were supposed to give the leftovers to the poor people begging outside of their homes. Many wealthy homes, in fact, had benches permanently constructed outside the doors so that the beggars could come and have a place to sit while waiting for the scraps from the table to fall to them. But Jesus tells a different version of reality in this story, and it upset people. One scholar I read said, To many who heard the parable, the turn of events would have come as a great surprise, for it was believed that blessings in life were a sign of God's favor, while illness, poverty, and hardships were signs of God's displeasure. But our antagonist in this morning's story failed even that basic test of sharing just the leftovers. He didn't even give Lazarus the scraps from his table. All right, curtain comes down, on to scene 2. The poor man, or Lazarus and the rich man are both dead. And the scene opens with this line: Lazarus was carried away by the angels to be with Abraham. That's a lovely image that I'm sure is all over medieval artwork. It is unfortunately a lousy translation of the original text. And it's a lousy translation because the original translation was too embarrassing, was too scandalous. The original words said, Lazarus was carried away by the angels to Abraham's bosom. And we all know we don't say bosom in church. That is embarrassing. It is too intimate. We like our relationships with a little distance, right? But here we get this image of a patriarch of Israel as a mother gathering her children to her breast. There's this sense that God's love is maternal. The world back then would have expected the reward for this poor man to be money, but instead, the reward in this parable is a relationship. It is an intimate relationship with God. Meanwhile, the rich man is buried, he's in Hades, and his life seems to be unchanged from the life he had before death. It's unchanged because he still treats people like objects who are there to serve him. His life seemed to be consumed by serving himself sumptuous food and fine clothing and ignoring the people around him. He probably had many servants. And in death, he's still trying to order people around. Listen to his language. Send Lazarus to dip the tip of his finger in water and cool my tongue. Send him to my father's house to warn my brothers. He hasn't learned anything. He's still treating people like they are his servants. A theologian named Rob Bell says it this way: the rich man never does get it. He approaches Abraham as if Abraham were his peer. Lazarus remains an inferior who can be sent to comfort the rich man. The rich man isn't in a place where he's ready to be with God because he can't yet recognize God in his neighbors, one of the very foundational pieces of the law that Abraham helped give to Israel. He hasn't learned yet that he is one of many people who are meant to serve each other. All right, then we go on to the final scene, part 3. Abraham utters those eerie words, "Between you and us, a great chasm has been fixed." But this chasm, it is not a feature of afterlife geology. This chasm is something very different. Rob Bell says it this way: the chasm is the rich man's heart. It hasn't changed. Even in death and torment and agony, he's still clinging to the old hierarchy. He still thinks he's better. In life, this man was isolated from other people by his own ego. And in death, he remains unchanged. We usually think of heaven and hell as places that we might go to one day. But in this story, heaven and hell are not places, they are adjectives. Heaven and hell describe the state of our hearts and whether or not they are open to other people. So what does this have to do with middle schoolers? If heaven and hell are adjectives, I cannot threaten my kids with hell very easily. I need some help in communicating these values to them. The trouble with communicating anything to one's own children is that they don't want to listen to their parents' stories. They want to experience the world for themselves and understand values more deeply than just being told about them. And that, I think, is where the church can help. Over the next year, I'm going to continue to pester you all with some of the foundational questions that we are wrestling with here as a community. And the big one that's been in my mind is, what is the point of church? Why are we here on Sunday mornings? I think this story gives us a clue that helps to answer that question. Church is about relationships. We know that social science tells us that happiness and fulfillment comes from the relationships we share with each other and the shared projects that we work on together to change the world around us. To quote David Brooks again, fulfillment is a byproduct. The purpose in life is not to find yourself, it's to lose yourself. To lose yourself by giving your heart away to other people, to needs of the world around us. The Bible is similar. Heaven and hell are characteristics of the way we treat each other here and now, and which carry on into the future. And a church may be one of the best places to put some flesh onto the bones of that theology. Because we are a social place, we can practice loving each other. Now, outside of this sanctuary, we have coffee hour and Sunday school and the women's group and parish retreats and camping trips and pastoral care, going out and visiting people. These things are not side dishes to the main meal that takes place up on our altar. These things are the place we put into practice the values that we commit to when we gather around our altar. The community life of a church is just as much the fabric of the church as the bread and wine of communion are. So we are in a good place as a community to practice relationships. And we may be lucky enough that we are even sometimes good enough to be at Abraham's bosom. We have something wonderful to share with the world. So we build on those relationships by sharing some of the meaning we derive from each other and some of the blessings God has given to us with the world outside our door. We share our blessings with the many, many, many impoverished people scattered throughout our community. We share our blessings and put them to work on the structural racism all around us, on the injustices that characterize so much of our community life. And if we do those things, if we put our theology into practice through relationships and meaningful work, just maybe we'll have more credibility with the middle schoolers. Amen.